Knew something was wrong the second my future mother-in-law set down the breadbasket and slid it past me without looking at my plate. Not rudely, not even noticeably to anyone else at the table. She just slid it past me like I wasn't there, and her hand kept moving until it reached her son. And then she smiled at him the way mothers smile at the only thing in the room that matters. I should back up. My name is Iris. I'm 31, and at the time of this dinner, I was the youngest chief of trauma surgery at one of the largest hospitals in the Pacific Northwest. I had 8 surgeons reporting to me, a residency program I had built from scratch, and a pager that had not been silent for more than 4 hours at a stretch in almost 3 years. None of that mattered that night. That night, I was just Owen's girlfriend, the one his mother had been hearing about, the one she was finally meeting for the first time. Owen and I had been together for 2.5 years. We met when he came into the ER one Sunday with a deep laceration on his palm from a kitchen knife that had gone where it shouldn't have gone. I wasn't his surgeon. I was just walking past the bay when he asked the resident, very calmly, if there was any chance someone could call his mother and let her know he'd be late to dinner. There was something about the way he asked, not embarrassed, not performative, just a grown man being honest that his mom would worry. I came back 20 minutes later to check on the resident's stitchwork and ended up talking to Owen for 45 minutes about absolutely nothing. The weather. A book he was reading. Whether the cafeteria coffee was as bad as he suspected. He never asked what I did. He just assumed I was a doctor of some kind because of the badge clipped to my scrubs. And when I told him I worked at the hospital, he nodded like that was enough information for a man with 7 stitches in his hand to take home and think about. He called me 3 days later from the number on the discharge paperwork. I said yes to coffee. I said yes to dinner. I said yes to a weekend in Bend, looking at the high desert in October. I said yes to almost everything Owen offered me, because Owen was the kind of man who offered things without keeping score. But I never told him exactly what I did. I told him I was a surgeon. That part was true. I told him I worked long hours and got called in at all kinds of strange times. That was true too. What I didn't tell him was that I ran the department, that I had been featured in 2 medical journals the year before, that when a state senator's daughter came through our doors after a car accident on I-5, I was the one they paged at 2 in the morning. I didn't tell him because I'd been down that road before. I'd been engaged once, years earlier, to a man who'd seemed wonderful until the day he found out I'd just been promoted to attending. After that, every dinner with his friends turned into a performance. Every argument we had eventually circled back to his career. I broke it off and promised myself the next time, if there was a next time, the person across from me would meet the woman before they met the resume. So I let Owen think I was a regular surgeon, the kind who shows up, does her shift, goes home. He never pressed. He's not that kind of man. When he asked me to come meet his mother in Spokane, I said yes immediately. He'd been a little nervous about it, which I found endearing. She's particular, he said. She has opinions about everything, about cars, about napkin folding, about who deserves what. Just be ready. Be ready for what? For her to size you up? I almost laughed. I'd been sized up by trauma boards, by hiring committees, by terrified parents in waiting rooms asking if their kid was going to live. I figured I could handle his mother. I figured wrong, but not in the way I expected. We flew into Spokane on a Friday afternoon in late October, rented a small SUV, and drove 20 minutes outside the city to the neighborhood where Owen had grown up. It was the kind of place where every yard had been mowed in the last 7 days, and every front door had a wreath on it. His parents lived in a brick 2-story with a covered porch and a wind chime that made a sound like someone tapping a wine glass. His mother answered the door before we'd finished climbing the steps. She was small, maybe 5'2", with her grey hair pulled back into the kind of low bun that takes practice. She hugged Owen for a long time. When she turned to me, she did this thing with her face that I've seen before in older women. A smile that's perfectly correct but doesn't actually use the eyes. "You must be Iris," she said. Come in, come in. It's so cold for October." His father was inside watching college football with the sound turned low. He stood up when I walked in, shook my hand firmly and said, "Owen has told us approximately nothing about you, so I guess we're starting fresh." Then he winked. I liked him immediately, and I think that's important to mention, because what happened later wasn't really his fault. He was just married to her, and he'd spent 40 years learning when to keep his head down. His mother, I'll call her by what she asked me to call her, which was Mrs. Mossel, Halloran, even though she told me earlier on the phone to call her by her first name. When I tried it that first night, she gave me a small tight smile and said, "Why don't we keep it formal for now until we know each other better?" I nodded like that was perfectly normal. There were 2 other people at dinner. Owen's older sister, a real estate agent named Jocelyn, and her husband, an orthopedist named Brent. I want to be honest. The minute I heard the word orthopedist, I tensed up. Because orthopedic surgeons and trauma surgeons interact constantly, and the medical world is small, and I had a quiet worry he'd recognize me. He didn't. He was based in Boise and had never rotated through my hospital. We shook hands, and he asked what kind of medicine I did, and I said, "Surgery, mostly trauma." And he nodded the way doctors nod at each other when they don't think it's worth following up. He turned back to his wife. The moment passed. Mrs. Halloran sat me at the corner of the table, not at her right hand, where Brent was, not at her left hand, where Owen ended up, the corner, where you put the cousin no one wants to talk to. I noticed. I didn't say anything. Dinner was a roast and twice-baked potatoes and green beans with almonds. Everything was on serving platters in the middle of the table, and Mrs. Halloran began to serve everyone. She served Owen first, then Jocelyn, then Brent, then her husband. When she got to me, she paused, looked at her platter and said, "Why don't you help yourself, dear? I never know how much to give people I don't know." It was such a small thing. Such a small, surgical little thing. I took the spoon and served myself, and I smiled, and I said, "Thank you, this looks wonderful." Owen squeezed my knee under the table. He'd noticed. But he didn't say anything. I don't blame him for that, not entirely. There's a way you learn to behave at your mother's dinner table by the time you're 34, and Owen had been studying that table for his whole life. Brent started talking about a new technique he'd been using on rotator cuff repairs. Jocelyn told a long story about a house she'd just closed on in Coeur d'Alene. Mr. Halloran told a story about a fishing trip with his brother. Mrs. Halloran asked Brent about his children, who were in Boise with a sitter. The conversation moved around the table like a polite little carousel, and it skipped me every single time. When it finally came around, Mrs. Halloran turned her body slightly toward me and said, "And Iris, Owen tells us you work at the hospital. Are you a nurse?" There it was. I want to say something here because I think it matters. I have enormous respect for nurses. I work with nurses every single day. The best nurses I know save lives in ways I will never get credit for, and I tell them so. The question itself wasn't insulting. What was insulting was the tone, the little lilt at the end. The way she said the word like it was the natural conclusion she'd already reached and was just giving me a chance to confirm. "I'm a surgeon," I said. "Oh," she blinked. "That's nice. Like Brent. A bit different specialty." She turned back to Brent. "Brent, tell them about that golfer you operated on. You know the one." Brent told a story about a famous golfer whose name I won't repeat because he probably shouldn't have. Owen looked at me sideways, like he was apologizing without speaking. I kept eating my green beans. Mr. Halloran tried. Bless him, he tried. He asked me where I was from. I told him I grew up in Salem. He asked about my parents. I told him my dad had been a high school physics teacher and my mom had taught 4th grade for 31 years. Mrs. Halloran made a small sound at that. Not a word, just a small acknowledging sound, like she'd filed it away. "Public school," she said eventually. "Yes, Mom." Both of them public. "Yes, Mom." "Well." She smiled at her wine glass. "That's wonderful. Salt of the earth." I knew what she meant. Anyone raised in any American family with old money knows what she meant. She meant that I had come from people who worked for the state, and that was a category she had a folder for. The folder was labeled fine. Jocelyn started telling me about Coeur d'Alene, like I'd never heard of it. Like I was someone she was hosting on a cultural exchange. It's an absolutely magical place, she said. Have you ever been? I had been, 3 times. I told her so. She said, oh, then you know how special it is. I agreed it was special. She moved on. After dinner, Mrs. Halloran cleared the plates. I stood up to help her. She put her hand on my wrist gently and said, oh no, dear. You sit down, you don't know where anything goes. She said it kindly. She said it the way you'd say it to a child or a house guest you didn't expect to see again. I sat down. Owen came into the kitchen with me a few minutes later when I went to refill my water glass. He took my face in both his hands and said, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with her tonight. I looked at him and I almost told him then. I almost said, Owen, this isn't tonight. This is who she is. She doesn't know what's wrong because nothing's wrong from her perspective. I'm a public school kid who works at a hospital and isn't a real surgeon in her mental file. There's nothing wrong. There's just me. But I didn't say any of that because I wanted to see how the evening played out. I wanted to know what she said when she thought I wasn't listening. I wanted to know what kind of man Owen would be when his mother kept reaching across his lap to skip me again and again, like I was a chair pushed too close to the table. I'm not proud of this. I want to be clear about that. There was a part of me that wanted to wait, to watch, to gather evidence. That's the part of me my fiancé before Owen had hated. He'd called it cold once. He wasn't wrong exactly. When you spent your whole adult life keeping a steady hand while someone bleeds out on a table, you learn to wait. You learn to watch the monitor. You don't react to the first thing. You react to the pattern. I sat back down. I let the pattern continue. After dessert, a peach cobbler that had been Owen's favorite as a boy, which Mrs. Halloran mentioned twice, we moved into the living room for coffee. Mr. Halloran asked me about football. I made the mistake of admitting I followed the Ducks, and that started a 15-minute argument about Pac-12 football that I actually enjoyed. He was funny when he forgot to be on his best behavior. I watched Mrs. Halloran watching her husband enjoy himself with me, and I saw something flicker across her face. She didn't like it. Iris, she said, when he paused to take a sip of his coffee. I've been meaning to ask. What does the chief of surgery do at your hospital? Is it like on TV? I don't know what they do on TV, I said. I don't watch the medical shows. Oh, you should. They're entertaining. She took a careful sip. I just wonder, who's your chief? Owen mentioned a name once. I can't remember. Owen looked at me. He had not mentioned my chief because he didn't know I had any particular relationship with my chief. He just looked at me. Her name is Iris, I said. Mrs. Halloran laughed politely. What a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. The room got quiet in that specific way. Rooms get quiet when nobody's sure what they just heard. Brent set down his coffee cup. Jocelyn leaned forward. Mr. Halloran said, wait. I'm the chief of trauma surgery at my hospital, I said. I said it the way I said most things, which is to say I said it once and didn't repeat it. Mrs. Halloran's smile froze, not faded, froze, like someone had pressed pause on her face. You're the chief, she said. Yes, ma'am. Of the whole department. Yes, ma'am. Of the whole department. Yes, ma'am. Are you sure? I didn't laugh. I wanted to, but I didn't. Yes, ma'am, I'm sure. Brent, the orthopedist, started laughing, not at me, at her. He was shaking his head and laughing in that low, embarrassed way. Men laugh when they realize they've been watching their mother-in-law step in something. Doris, he said, that was her name. I'm calling her Mrs. Halloran here. But Brent used her name. Doris, do you know how big her hospital is? I assumed it was a hospital. Mrs. Halloran said somewhat stiffly. It's the regional level 1 trauma center for half the state. She's running it. I'm not running the whole hospital, I said quickly. Just trauma. Iris, Brent said, and he turned to me with an expression I'd seen on 1,000 other doctors when they finally place where they know you from. Are you Iris from the burn protocol paper? The one in the journal last fall? I nodded. Oh my God. He turned to his wife. Josie. I read this woman's paper twice. Jocelyn looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Mr. Halloran started laughing, and once he started, he couldn't stop. It was the laugh of a man who had spent 40 years married to a woman who decided who mattered before they'd taken their coat off, and who was now watching her have to recalibrate in real time. He wasn't being mean. He was being relieved. I think he'd been quietly worried about me all night. Mrs. Mees Halloran did not laugh. She set down her coffee very carefully, the way you set down something fragile. She looked at her son. Owen, she said, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me? I didn't know, Owen said, quietly, looking at me. You didn't know what your girlfriend does. I knew she was a surgeon. I didn't know about the chief part. Why on earth wouldn't you ask? Because I didn't need to. I want to say something here about Owen. Because this is the moment in the story where most people would expect the real action. The reveal happened. The ID got slapped on the table. Now what does he do? What he did was he reached over and took my hand. He didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't defend me. He didn't yell at his mother. He just took my hand the same way he'd taken it on our second date when we were walking through a parking lot in the rain. Like holding my hand was a thing he did and would keep doing regardless of who else was in the room. And then he said something I'll remember for the rest of my life. He said, Mom, I didn't ask because I liked her before I knew, and I wanted to keep liking her without it being mixed up in anything else. I'm sorry if that was naive. He wasn't apologizing to me. He was apologizing to her for not giving her the information she would have needed to behave better. There was a sting in that. He knew what she'd been doing all night, and he knew that if he told her in advance, she'd have served me first. Mrs. Halloran stood up. She walked into the kitchen. We heard the water turn on, then off, then nothing for a long time. Mr. Halloran cleared his throat. Well, he said, I think I'd like another cup of coffee. Iris, can I get you one? Yes, please. He went into the kitchen. We heard low voices. We couldn't make out the words. Jocelyn, to her credit, tried to recover. She said, Iris, I'm so sorry. We had no idea. Which is exactly the wrong thing to say after a dinner like that, and to her credit she heard it as it came out of her mouth and tried to fix it. I mean, not that it should have mattered. I mean, oh God, I'm making it worse. You're fine, I said. Don't worry about it. It's just that Mom is, I know. She's actually a really good person, I know. Brent was still shaking his head and chuckling. He looked at me with new eyes now. The eyes of a fellow professional. The eyes of someone who had read my work. I have so many questions about your transfusion threshold, he said. I laughed for the first time all night. Email me, Brent. We'll talk shop. Mrs. Halloran came back from the kitchen. She had washed her face. You could tell, because the makeup around her eyes was slightly different than it had been at dinner. She walked over to where I was sitting, and she stood there, holding a fresh napkin, like she didn't know what to do with her hands. Iris, she said. May I sit? Of course. She sat down next to me on the couch, not across from me. Next to me. Close enough that I could smell her perfume, which was the kind of perfume my own grandmother had worn. I owe you an apology, she said. It's all right. It's not all right. I treated you the way I treat people I've already decided don't matter, and I'm ashamed of that. Not because of who you turned out to be. Because of how I behaved before I knew. I looked at her. I don't know what I expected. Not that. not the second sentence. The first sentence is what people say when they want absolution. The second sentence is what people say when they've actually thought about it. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully. My husband just told me in the kitchen that I've been acting like my own mother. She gave a small, dry laugh, which is the worst thing he could have said to me, and he knew it. He's a smart man. He is. He hides it well. She looked at her hands. I had a script, you know. I had a whole script for tonight. I was going to find out where you went to school and what your parents did, and I was going to slot you into the appropriate place in my head, and I was going to be very polite for 2 or 3 years until Owen either married you or didn't. That was the plan. I know, I said. She looked up at me, surprised. You know? Mom, I do this for a living. I read body language. I read what people aren't saying. I knew within 4 minutes of walking in here what your plan was, and you stayed. I stayed. Why? I thought about how to answer that. Owen was watching us from across the room. He was very still. He knew this was the actual moment of the night, the one all of dinner had been the warm-up for. Because I wanted to know who you were when you thought I was nobody, I said. I'd been engaged before. I broke it off when I realized he loved a version of me that was about to start making more money than him. I didn't want to do that again. I wanted to meet the woman who would have to live with me at Thanksgivings for the rest of her life. I needed to know what she was like when the room was tilted in her direction. Mrs. Halloran nodded slowly. She didn't argue. She didn't get defensive. She didn't say I should have given her a chance. And now you know, she said. Now I know. And what are you going to do? I looked across the room at Owen. He was looking back at me. He had not let go of the place on the couch where my hand had been before I'd shifted positions. I'm going to think about it, I said. She nodded. That's fair. Here is the part where I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the whole point of telling this story at all. The car ride back to our hotel that night was very quiet. Owen was driving. I was looking out the window at neighborhoods I'd never seen before, with their reeds and their wind chimes and their leaves being raked into piles. After a while, Owen said, I'm sorry. I know. Are you breaking up with me? I don't know yet. He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me. He just kept driving. After another long silence, he said, Can I say something that's going to sound bad? Sure. I'm a little relieved. I turned to look at him. Relieved about what? That you're who you are. The chief part. He kept his eyes on the road. I've been worrying for almost a year that you were too good for me. I make $86,000 a year managing a logistics company in a mid-size office. I drive a 4-year-old Subaru. I knew you were a surgeon, but I told myself, okay, lots of doctors are just regular people. And then tonight, the way Brent looked at you, he's never looked at me like that, and he's known me for 10 years. So I'm relieved, because now I know what I'm worried about, instead of being worried about nothing in particular. I didn't say anything for a while. Iris, he said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Okay, if you told me on our first coffee that you were the chief, would I have asked you out again? I don't know. I don't either. I want to think I would have, but I'm not sure, and I think that's worth knowing about myself. I looked at him for a long time. The streetlights of his hometown were sliding past his face in slow yellow stripes. Owen, I said, I'm not breaking up with you tonight. Okay, but I'm not engaged to you tonight either. You weren't engaged to me yesterday either, technically. I know, I'm just saying we have some things to figure out, okay? Your mum's not the only one with a script. You have one too. You just hadn't gotten to the part of it that involved a woman who outranks you. He took a long breath. Yeah, that's fair. It's not bad. It's just there. It's a thing we have to look at. Yeah. We drove the rest of the way in a silence that was not the same silence we'd been in before. It was a working silence. It was the silence of two people who had decided to think instead of perform. We went back to Spokane twice more before Christmas. Once for Thanksgiving. which his mother insisted on me attending despite me offering an easy out, and which she handled with a kind of quiet humility that surprised me. She asked me about my work. Real questions. The kind you ask when you've actually read up on what someone does. I found out later that she'd asked Brent for a reading list. The second visit was for a Christmas Eve service at her church, where she introduced me to people by my name, just my name, not by my title and not by what I did. I appreciated that more than she'll ever know. Owen and I did get engaged eventually. About 14 months after that first dinner, he proposed in the parking lot of a coffee shop in Portland on a Tuesday morning, with no ring because he'd been carrying it in his coat pocket for 2 weeks, and that morning he just couldn't take carrying it anymore. He said, "I had a whole speech and I forgot every word of it. Will you marry me anyway?" I said yes. We didn't have a big wedding. We had 36 people in a backyard in May. Mrs. Halloran came. She wore a navy dress and cried when Owen and I read our vows, and when she hugged me after the ceremony, she whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on us." I don't tell this story because I think I did anything brave. I didn't. I sat at a dinner table and I let myself be served last, and I waited. That's not bravery. That's patience. Impatience comes cheap to people who've trained themselves for it. I tell it because I think a lot of women have sat at a version of that dinner. Not always with a future mother-in-law. Sometimes it's a boss. Sometimes it's a brother-in-law. Sometimes it's a stranger at a wedding who decides within 30 seconds whether you're worth turning the body toward. And I think most of those women have learned the way I learned, that you can either get angry every time or you can pay attention. Pay attention to the breadbasket. Pay attention to whose plate gets served first. Pay attention to who follows up on the answer you gave and who doesn't. Pay attention to whether the person across from you asks a second question, or just nods politely and moves on. Pay attention to whether your partner squeezes your knee under the table, and whether, when you finally tell them the part of yourself you've been keeping back, they reach for your hand or pull away. The reveal is not the point. The reveal is just the lights coming on. What you see when the lights come on, the way people's faces are arranged in that first half second before they remember to compose themselves. That's the point. That's the whole story. I have a daughter now. She's 2.5. She has Owen's eyes and my stubbornness. When she's old enough to date, I'm going to tell her this story, and I'm going to tell her the part that took me longest to understand, which is that the breadbasket moment isn't a test you give other people. It's a test you give yourself. It's the moment you decide whether you're going to perform or whether you're going to wait and watch and learn. I waited, I watched, I learned. And the man who took my hand on that couch, in front of his mother, in the middle of the most uncomfortable evening of my adult life. He's upstairs right now, reading a bedtime story to a little girl who has no idea yet how much she's going to need her mother to have learned all of this. That's the ending. That's how it actually ends. Not with a slap down, not with a triumph. Just with a quiet house and a stairwell light on and a man's voice doing the silly different character voices in a book about a rabbit who wants to go to the moon. That's what I traded the loud version of this story for, and I'd do it again every single time. I've thought a lot in the years since that dinner in Spokane about why I let it play out the way I did. I could have said something the moment Dora slid the breadbasket past my plate. I could have stood up when she handed me the serving spoon and told me to help myself. I could have corrected her the first time she asked if I was a nurse. Any of those would have ended the evening faster, and most people I've told this story to think that's what I should have done. But here's what I've come to believe. The way someone treats you when they think you don't matter is not random. It's a habit. And habits don't change because they get caught once. They change because the person carrying them around decides, in private, in their own head, that the habit isn't who they want to be anymore. Doris had to see herself in that mirror. I couldn't hold it up for her. If I'd snapped at her over the breadbasket, she would have spent the rest of her life telling herself I was rude at dinner, and she would have died, still believing she'd done nothing wrong. That's what I mean about cause and effect. The cause wasn't her cruelty because she wasn't cruel. The cause was that she had spent 70 years sorting people into folders without ever being asked to defend the system, and the effect, the only effect that could actually change anything, was for the system to fail her in public, in front of her family, with her own son holding the hand of the woman she'd been quietly diminishing all night. I didn't engineer that. I just refused to interrupt it. I think about Owen too, about the way he took my hand on that couch without making a speech about it. He didn't perform for me. He just stayed. And later, in the car, he said the thing that I think every honest person eventually has to say to someone they love. I don't know yet if I'm the man you deserve, but I want to find out, and I'm willing to be uncomfortable while we figure it out. That kind of honesty takes more courage than any grand gesture I've ever seen on a movie screen. If there's anything I'd want my daughter to learn from this, it's 3 small things that I think have to be carried at the same time. The first is that decency isn't something you turn on for people who can do something for you. It's the floor you stand on regardless of who's in the room. The second is that watching is not the same as being passive. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is take in the whole picture before you respond. And the third is that the people worth keeping in your life are the ones who can sit with being wrong without falling apart. Doris cried in her kitchen that night, and then she came back and sat down next to me. That's not weakness. That's the beginning of becoming a different person. And I spent most of my adult life learning that we are all, every one of us, somewhere in the middle of that becoming.